Page 9 of the Amaral file was Priya's favorite slide to teach from. A mother had typed height top percentile into the intake form, and Helix answered back, calm and blue, that is not a disease. She never told the room whose signature was underneath it. Dr. Priya Nandan had run ethics training for new genetic counselors at Meridian Fertility Institute for 11 years, and in that time she had made herself the one person in the building who policed the line nobody else wanted to police. Since the federal disease-only cap of 2029 passed after a rival clinic in Scottsdale got caught editing embryos for cosmetic jawlines and calmer temperaments, a mess everyone in the field still just called the Songbird scandal, Helix, Meridian's germline modeling system, was legally permitted to flag and correct single-gene disease risk. Nothing else. Priya had turned nothing else into a kind of personal scripture, the first thing trainees learned from her before consent forms, before embryology, before anything. She had a reputation for it. Colleagues joked that Priya could smell a vanity request through 3 layers of clinical language, and she never entirely laughed it off because it was true and because she had never once explained where the nose came from. At home, she was raising a 12-year-old named Kavi, who swam the 400 freestyle like his lungs had been built by someone with more patience than God usually bothered with, and who carried a stillness at the blocks his coaches called ice water and asked her about it every single meet, half joking, half not. What do you feed this kid? She kept his last meet photo taped inside the binder she used to teach the Amaral case, on the facing page from the redacted intake form, and she told trainees most years that genetics was mostly luck dressed up afterward as design. She believed it every time she said it. That was the part she was proudest of, actually, not the belief, but how completely she'd built a life around not questioning it. Her husband Thomas, an aerospace engineer who had never once sat through one of her seminars, liked to say she policed Meridian's clients the way other people alphabetize spice racks, compulsively and slightly to the detriment of the dinner conversation. The trainees had their own favorite story about her, the one about the couple who'd wanted their daughter's future resilience to criticism adjusted, framed as an anxiety disorder correction. Priya had failed the request twice in writing before the couple withdrew from the program entirely. She told that story often. She had never once in 11 years told the Amaral story in the first person. The subpoena came from a House subcommittee reopening pre-2029 editing violations across a dozen clinics that had operated before the cap, Meridian among them, following a whistleblower at a Texas facility who'd leaked internal logs showing edits far outside stated disease exceptions: cheekbone symmetry, sleep need reduction. One particularly ugly case involving a hedge fund founder's twins and a battery of cognitive processing markers nobody in the industry wanted printed in a newspaper. The committee's public framing was aggressive. Institutions, not individual parents, were being asked to account for what their systems had quietly approved in the gray years before anyone drew a hard line. A staffer named Denise Ochoa called on a Tuesday afternoon asking for the complete unredacted chart behind what the discovery documents referred to only as patient MFI 00214. Because the version that had circulated for years, the one used in teaching material at 3 separate institutions now, had apparently been anonymized at its source, and no unredacted original had yet surfaced anywhere in the committee's document requests. Priya, as records custodian for anything older than 15 years, told Denise she'd pull it herself rather than root it through a paralegal and a week of delay. It felt, she told herself, like due diligence, the same instinct that made her double-check every trainee's paperwork twice. She mentioned it to Thomas that evening the way she mentioned any paperwork, half a sentence over dishes, and he said only, "That old thing again," in a tone she didn't examine closely enough at the time, already thinking about the vault, about tomorrow's shelf list, about nothing in particular. Her badge failed on the first swipe at the vault door, which never happened, and she needed a supervisor override in a code she hadn't typed in years, which struck her as strange because she was fairly sure she had requested this exact file herself at some point and knew precisely where it lived on the shelf without checking the index. Inside, the real scan looked nothing like the version she had taught from for a decade. The physician Cautionary was dated 11 months earlier than she remembered ever citing. The mother's listed age was 22. Priya was 44 now and had always privately dated the case in her own head to some frightened couple in their 30s, a detail she realized standing in the cold of the vault with the folder open in her hands. She had never once verified against the actual document, and had never once needed to, because until that afternoon she had never needed the file to be about someone else quite this specifically. The maiden name typed on the intake form was Amaral. Priya's maiden name was Amaral. Patient MFI 00214 was her own chart, filed 14 years before she ever held a counseling license. Back when she was a 22-year-old with a swimming scholarship, she had just lost to a lung infection that left one lobe permanently scarred, and a fiancé, Thomas, whose family carried a CFTR mutation that made a monogenic correction the entire visible, legitimate reason they were in the building at all. That correction was legal, standard, and fully documented, the kind of case Meridian still cited as a model of appropriate use. What Priya had forgotten, or had spent a decade arranging her life so she wouldn't have to remember doing on purpose, was the line beneath it in the additional preferences field, where 22-year-old Priya, still grieving a scholarship and half convinced her ruined lungs were the only unfinished thing about her, had typed respiratory capacity. Maximize, reading it at the time as nothing more than a safety margin stacked harmlessly on top of a medical fix. Helix's cautionary line, dated and fully legal under the looser rules in effect that specific year, read, correlated trait approved under disease exception. Nobody had broken any law. She had simply been the 22-year-old who asked a machine to hand her son the one thing she could no longer get back for herself, filed under the one column that made it sound like medicine instead of grief. 2 years after Kavi was born, she had taken a job at the exact clinic that held that chart, not despite the case. She understood now, standing in the vault, but because of it, so she would always be the one person standing close enough to keep it from becoming somebody else's excuse. She had taught it every year since then, scrubbed of names as a warning about a couple who had pushed too far. It had never once in 11 years been a confession. It had always been one. Thomas, she realized, standing there with the folder open, had known the whole time. That old thing again hadn't been a husband bored by paperwork. It had been a man watching his wife walk toward a door she'd spent a decade building a career to avoid, and staying quiet because she'd never once asked him to help her open it. That night she didn't give Kavi another vague answer about why his lungs did the weird thing during the third 50 of a 400, the thing his coaches kept asking about like it was a gift she had modestly declined to explain. She put the real, unredacted chart on the kitchen table next to his cereal bowl and let him read page 9 himself. Thomas stood at the counter, not sitting, not leaving either, which she understood now was exactly the distance he'd kept for 12 years. Kavi was quiet for a while, the same stillness he carried at the blocks, running one finger down the page like he was checking a split time against a heat sheet. Then he asked the only question that turned out to matter. "Did you pick anything else about me?" "No," she said, "just that." "Okay," he said, and went back to checking that morning's practice times on his phone, not devastated, not thrilled. Just a kid updating one fact about himself and moving on to the next set on the schedule. The way he'd move past a slower than expected split and start planning the next one. It was, Priya realized, watching him, the option she had spent a decade refusing to give either of them. Not protection, not a redacted slide in front of strangers, just telling him, and finding out the story had never actually been the threat to him that it had always been to her. Before she left for the clinic the next morning, she took the Amaral slide out of her teaching binder for the first time in 11 years and didn't replace it with anything, leaving the page blank rather than reaching for a cleaner story. Then she called Denise Ochoa back before she could talk herself out of it, gave her own married name as the signer of record, and submitted the file whole and unredacted, under Priya Amaral Nandan, to a subcommittee that had spent months looking for a document that had been standing in front of a classroom the entire time, teaching from itself. She used to teach that a mistake and a decision were two different things. Only one of them, it turned out, she would still make again every single time.